I'm very pleased to be here. We live in a country which is very peculiar, with a very strong state, and they invented the term savage liberalism. You know that Stalin was always talking about capitalism. They're the enemies of population. In Italy, instead, we have savage liberalism. So sometimes I tell people, okay, touch me, you can meet a savage liberalist. You sometimes, happen to meet them. So my presentation starts off from this. It goes back to the year zero. So we're going a far way back, and this goes up to 1500 and then the year 2000. So this is the world growth, the world and not the Western world. It's the world economic growth up to the year 500. As you can see, the line is flat. From the year 500 to the Napoleonic Wars, it starts going up, it starts rising, because only the West is there. It's only occurring in Europe, and to a minimum extent of the little part that was there in the United States. Then from the Industrial Revolution onwards, it actually explodes. Now, if you were a person from Mars, if you were a Martian, and you arrived here and they only showed you this graph, what would you think? Do you want to go back to do you want to go back to pre 1500 with an average of less than $100 a year at constant dollars of 2004, or would you rather have a world which in the past 20 years have taken out of misery 1 billion people? Because the rest of the world keeps on growing. And this is important. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about the European miracle from the year 1500 onwards. When the conquistadores left Europe, they were shocked, and not so much by the beauty of the rest of the world that were very impressive indeed, but rather by the fact that the society that had been created on the ashes of ancient Greece and the Roman Empire was much, much more advanced than all the rest. And all this was due to one single thing that I would call freedom. So from at the beginning, the question was, how did the West get rich? So a lot of experts studied this. So why is it that the West flourishes whilst the rest of the world doesn't? And now we need to ask ourselves the opposite question. Why is it that the rest of the world grows at constant levels, around 6-7%, whilst the West has stopped growing? The US have grown in the post-war period at 3.5%. From the last crisis onwards, they dream this growth. This growth is over. An old economist once said, he was asked, what are the causes of poverty? And the economist answered, poverty has no causes. It's something which is absolutely normal. What we need to explain is wealth. So we need to realize that wealth today is concentrated in just a few hands. It's part of a very small area of the world. The rest, the history of humanity is a history of poverty. And we will get back there unless the government will save us. Now, if we look at history, we see that modernity, which I identify with capitalism, I also studied all of these various topics, philosophical topics as well, but I believe that wealth is a value in itself. And an increase in wealth is not something that should be questioned. It's a value in itself. So where is the birth of modernity? In this area. So around Italy, the area around Italy, what we call the Lotharingia, which starts in Florence and ends in Antwerp, then in the Low Countries, in the lowlands, and then in England, in northern France. Then it expanded subsequently to the rest of Europe. It was very, very successful in the US, as we know, then in Canada, in Australia, Japan, and recently China, Korea, Brazil, and Russia. But the point is that we don't have a lot of ways to create wealth. There's only one way to create wealth. Private property of production means, market economy, role of the entrepreneur, economic rationality, and certain values which support all this, and a low rate of policies. If there were a way that Zambia achieved wealth, or a way in which Tasmania did, a way in which the US, a way in which the Argentine, we could discuss about the various models, but there's only one model in reality to create wealth. Otherwise, there's only poverty as the alternative. So what has capitalism been? The problem is that capitalism has been successful by creating what it defined as values of use. It creates fictitious needs to then satisfy them, or this would be said by Rousseau, so I don't want to insist on this. So what do we need? We need incentives. We need people who want to exploit the capitalistic experiments and who must know that they will keep profits for themselves. Otherwise, they would never do it, obviously. There should be no restrictions, political or religious restrictions, obviously. And so when capitalism was created in Europe, the area from a cultural standpoint was extremely integrated. But on the political level, there was nothing to integrate it. So basically, there was no big universal empire. And from a cultural point of view, there's something which takes place which is only true in the West, and still today is only true in those countries where the Industrial Revolution has been successful. To become richer is preferable than becoming a bishop rather than a general of the army. So to have a career in the church or to have a career in the state. This is something which started off in the Renaissance Italy, so at the end of the Middle Ages already, and then it continued up to, and it still is true today in all of the wealthy countries in Lombardy region, for instance, here in northern Italy, which will soon become one of the richest areas in the world. So the elite is interested. They understand that making money is something which is very reasonable, much better than doing other things. But what has made all this possible? The explanation of the birth of capitalism, we know that in Marx it doesn't exist. He explains capitalism with capitalism. And Marx defines capitalism very correctly as the moment in which workers do not own the means to work. And then Marx is asked, but when was capitalism created? He said, when they are dispossessed of their working means. And so when people ask, but what is the shift from feudalism to capitalism? According to him, it doesn't exist. So we've received a lot of answers to this question, but the most convincing one lies in a non-event, in a non-occurrence. In Europe, there's something which has never happened. That is, there's never been a universal empire. So Charles V, Napoleon, Charlemagne, Hitler, they made attempts to create a universal empire throughout Europe, but this did not happen. They didn't succeed in doing this. So let's say the freedom of the West derives from the non-existence of the universal empire. And Europe remained in a situation of non-dominion with very fragmented territory in a system which, even at its beginning, was a system of competitive federalism, where it was very easy to exit, to vote, to abandon places, and to abandon also your small realities. So to have what today are called those exit rights. So the territorial difference has meant a limited exploitation by the political power, which was like a hunter that had limitations. The limitations derived from the fact that there were also other hunters that maybe were less predatory and attract capital and resources. So in practice, what happened in first modern times and in the second modern times has been a situation of semi-sovereign states, semi-independent states that were all competing one with the other. But what did not occur in a military manner, is now there's an attempt of creating it democratically. So this universal empire for Europe, which has made wealth possible in Europe, I mean, the European Union is trying to create this through democratic means. And they constantly talk about harmonization, single taxation, a single Leviathan. And what are the exit rights here? There are two ways, basically, to check this oppressive state. Either you abandon it, and the other means is to export your capital. So fiscal evasion, you export capital. This is the only way in which you can monitor and keep a check on the Leviathan. It talks about fiscal havens because they have created a fiscal hell. What the Leviathan calls the fiscal heavens in reality is not exactly a heaven. Just think about Switzerland. If we look at the reality of things, if we look at the area in which the leadership was concentrated in wealth creation up to, at the end of medieval times up to the beginning of modern times, it's the area that we call Lotharingia, from Florence to Antwerp. This is a term that's recently been relaunched. Then we had the lowlands, for instance, in the 17th century. Subsequently, from the Napoleonic Wars, from the end of the 18th century, for a century, this was obviously, it was the UK that was the very center for the creation of planetary wealth. And then from 1990 up to now, it's been the US. So what are we talking about? Well, first of all, for northern Italy, we can't talk about Middle Ages, about a true state. Then two federal countries such as the United Provinces may be concerned, but also Holland and the US may be considered. Even if after the Civil War, obviously, this federalism found it difficult to survive. And then the English area with the lowest imaginable taxation in the period of the development of the Industrial Revolution. So the lesson we can draw from history is very simple. If we believe that wealth creation is a value, then we can live, like St. Francis in poverty, believing that praying is the only important thing, but we wouldn't be here today, probably. In reality, politics must be kept at the lowest possible level. If we want to create wealth, politics basically should almost disappear. So what is the solution? We need to disaggregate all that which the tradition has passed on to us. The tradition that has always made us think that it's too big to fail. In reality, it's too big not to fail. So all of these continental aggregations go against history. It had seemed in a certain period with a Western utopia, with Immanuel Kant in his book, The Perpetual Peace, that aggregations could lead to peace. But in reality, they don't lead to peace, but rather lead to the destruction of wealth. So if we think that the future may still have a hope of creating freedom and wealth for individuals, we need to destroy these enormous leviathans and create political units which are similar to Swiss cantons. One of my students had been impressed by my pessimism during the debates that we were holding during our courses, obviously, because before you may give a scientific presentation, but then when she asked me for a few words of reassurance, and I said, how many words do you want, 3 or 26? If you want 3, it was the name of the Swiss cantons, basically, or the name of the 26 cantons, because it's the only idea that reminds us of a typical liberty that was typical of the medieval man who was serf and servant to too many men, and so servant of nobody. And the man who came after told the medieval man, I will free you for all your corporations. You're a slave of the church. I will make you free. Yes, I will make you free, but with a taxation between 60 and 70%. And this is the way you get free here. If you pay taxes at 60, 70% of what you earn, and all of the promises of emancipation have created this fiscal hell that we find ourselves in.
So we must go back to the future in a nutshell. back to being, again, slaves of governments on the same territory. They compete in order to obtain our support, our alliance. They are strong enough to be combating one another. So the historical work of the thought of the American institution between the Revolution and the Civil War is the only example in the United States that between the Revolution and the Civil War, federalism being authentic, between that period of time, the federal government, instead of increasing, growing, it became smaller. Then with Ronald Reagan, presented himself with the farewell welfare slogan, and right after that, over 12 years, Reagan, Bush father, we had a 12% growth rate in the number of official people on the federal government. So the system is so that it can really continue with its own rationale. I don't have much time left, I think. So what I'm saying is that my idea, my view, we are facing something which is very similar to the collapse of communism. The advantage of our friends during that collapse is that nobody would accept and buy the the lies of people. Everybody would laugh, knowing perfectly well that the only issue was and question is, how come that it really lasted 70 years? But in reality, we have tens and tens of explanations, and one, funnier than the other one. We have sovereign debt. People say that it's bankers that caused this, but it was government. So we have the fiscal ripoff of the most productive regions due to political decisions of governments. We have a public spending which is 55% of our GDP. Is this being decided by the market? I doubt it strongly. It's obviously all decided by governments. So all these exact aspects in this crisis are specific decisions made by governments, by politicians, and we continue to believe that the problem could be you, bankers, markets, and wild liberalism. Liberalism, when Italy was under this para system in the second mid of the 1800s, somebody would believe this was saying that a taxation over 8% would cause a severe damage and harm to the national economy. If we go up to 70, what kind of wild liberalism can we talk about and discuss? But the key aspect is that in reality, the size, the scope of the political community does matter, and a lot. Major issues and problems can all be brought down to the history of its same size. A small state, a small administration would pay for the huge costs of protectionism. Right after the end of communism, Slovenia was growing 10% a year. That was one of the most open areas. Boundaries will be open, and the exit costs would be minimum. Anyway, in all political cultures, and I will simply take away one more minute, across the history of philosophy, political philosophy of the past 500 years, nobody ever made an attempt, even a theoretical attempt, of challenging the state on the issue of the monopoly of force. Starting from that, the state has been building all the other monopolies. Monopoly of right. When I was small and a child, they were telling me that they also had to have telephones. The state had to take care of that too. Then we saw that maybe, telephones were not an actual monopoly. The idea of John Locke was a wonderful utopia, making governments a defender of widows, orphans, and the ownership of private citizens. Because during history, states have been causing more widows and orphans and have destroyed more wealth than any other private institution you can imagine. So It is really funny to think that states had to make an effort to blame for the crisis of the 29, which was the first big crisis of the public intervention, to capitalism, to blame for the 2008 crisis again, capitalism for that. But we heard from Steve in an exceptional way that this was due to the intervention of public policies again. I mean, they even went to the extent of saying that 50 million deaths in the Second World War were caused by a crazy person named Hitler. 50 million deaths. Well, there must be a problem if a crazy person can cause such a big number to die. I mean, it wouldn't really seem that this is real on markets. The idea of believing that individuals had their private space guaranteed by private property, by the rule of law, by natural rights, with the state being the guarantor, simply strengthen the state even more. We are experiencing the end, the disruption of any myth in classical liberalism, constitutionalism, that is a limitation to power, the great dream of John Locke of putting in a cage the Leviathan, imagine a half a century earlier, to put it in a cage with these aims, with the safeguard of the life of private people, property ownership, etc., came to an end when once they asked to Gandhi when he went to the UK, what do you think about the British civilization? And Gandhi responded, I believe it would be a great idea, I repeat. Thank you.